It is from numerous, diverse acts of courage that human history is shaped. Each time someone stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and injustice. Those words were spoken at the University of Cape Town, South Africa in 1966 by a young Senator Robert Francis Kennedy. They are inscribed on his memorial at Arlington National Cemetery as well, and they have been a powerful source of inspiration for my generation ever since. My own personal involvement with poverty and homelessness began up close and personal in the Third World, where I worked in the Philippines and India and Mexico. And here at home, in the early 1980s, when I came face to face with another man who was to become one of my heroes, Mitch Snyder in Washington, D.C. I was asked to come over there in the very bitter winter of 1985-86 to play him in a movie for television called Samaritan. Mitch Snyder was a community activist. Duh, Sarah Palin, as was Cesar Chavez, as was Martin Luther King Jr., as was that young itinerant rabbi from the Holy Land about 2,000 years ago who really shook things up organizing. Anyway, Mitch was responsible through a community called the Nonviolent Community Center for Creative Nonviolence in Washington, built the shelter right under the Reagan administration nose in Washington at 60D. It was a so-called model shelter for homeless in the nation's capital. He achieved it mainly with protest. He went on numerous fasts in front of the White House. He was carted away. He spent a lot of time in jail. He almost died after a 42-day fast. But he established that shelter, so he was quite a force to be reckoned with. Some of you here I know him. When I was asked to play him, I thought I should get to know this guy, and I saw him on 60 Minutes interview, and I thought, wow, okay. So I went over to Washington where we were going to shoot it to get to know him, and he picked me up at the airport in an old beat-up car that belonged to the shelter. It was so cold, I couldn't understand why he had the air conditioning on, because it was as cold inside the car as it was outside. Then I realized there was a huge hole in the floor of the car on the passenger side. He noticed that I noticed it, and he said, oh, don't worry, I go out of my way to avoid puddles. He got me settled in a hotel near the shelter, and then he said, if you want to know what homelessness is like, I'm going to invite you to spend the day on a heating grate outside the Justice Department. And we did. And he said, you are a known celebrity, but I promise you, no one will recognize you this day. And he was absolutely right. We bundled up in blankets and sat on that grate all day. And some people, we were not soliciting for funds, but many people stopped to give us money, but they never looked at us, and they never stopped to say hello or how are you, and it just made a quick drop and took off. And that was an extraordinary realization. As we were sitting there, he asked me a lot of questions about my life, where I came from, what I stood for, what I hoped for. And the first question he asked me, he said, how many pairs of shoes do you own? I thought he meant, how many did you bring with you on this trip? And I said, 2. He said, well, you know, you're only entitled to 1 as long as there is someone barefoot. I thought, oh my, I'm dealing with a saint here. But we became very close friends. And he would call me from time to time to come over to Washington for fundraisers for the shelter or for protest demonstrations. And one day, about a year after we finished the film, he called me with an urgent message. He said, please come to Washington this night. There's something very important going on. And I didn't hesitate. I went over to D.C. and I met him at a corner where the subway line runs in Washington, D.C. And the issue was that the city was going to close the entrance to the subway at midnight that night. They were going to put a grate across it. Why it was critical was because there were several dozen homeless people who had access going down into the subway. They couldn't get onto the subway platform because there was a bar there at midnight, but they could keep warm by the residual heat coming from the subway. And this was going to be denied to them because they were going to shut the subway off at the street level, and so he said, we're going to protest there and do civil disobedience, and you're welcome to join us. What was I going to do? I ended up in jail that night after a very powerful protest, and he was the most comfortable man I ever met in a cell. He would go to sleep instantly. I was worried about the roaches. I remember putting toilet paper in my ears and the roaches crawl up while I'm sleeping. I could hear him snoring. Anyway, that very night, we concocted a program called the Great American Celebrity Sleep Out, and that's what Congresswoman Spears was speaking about, where we invited members of Congress, the entertainment industry, and recording industry, celebrities, sports celebrities, to come out, spend the night on the grates in Washington, D.C., a very cold night. It raised a lot of consciousness and got a lot of attention and brought a lot of volunteers to help with the shelter and a lot of people to help with homelessness. That was in 1986. Unfortunately, Mitch was weighed down by a lot of deeply personal, painful problems, as so many of us are, and he took his own life on July 4th, 1990. I still miss him. They renamed the shelter at 6th and D, the Mitch Shelter, the Mitch Snyder Shelter. So if you ever go there, you'll see the effects that one man can have in our culture. Okay, meanwhile,